21 hands. That's how many voted to exile her, to send her past the tree line with nothing. Because in this world, exile doesn't mean banishment. It means they leave you there to die. She counted every hand. She didn't beg, she didn't cry. She had absolutely no intention of walking into that forest and disappearing the way they needed her to, but she counted, because counting was the only thing left she could control. And then the main doors opened, both panels, at once. Every wolf who had just sentenced her stepped backwards without realizing they were doing it. 2 inches, eyes forward, shoulders recalibrated. The involuntary physics of a room recognizing something above them in the hierarchy. 7 words. That's all he said. She's not going anywhere. She's mine. The exile was suspended before Elder Dorne could finish drawing breath. But she wasn't rescued. Not exactly. Because a man doesn't override a 21-vote council majority for a woman he's never spoken to, unless she isn't what they told her she was. And what she actually was had just detonated 22 years of lies that powerful people had killed to keep buried. 21 hands and not one person in that room lost sleep over it? Drop a comment right now and tell me which character you would have been. The one who voted, the one who abstained, or the one still standing in the center counting.
The scrape of wood against stone echoed too loudly when they moved her forward. Lillian did not flinch at the sound. She had learned years ago that flinching invited attention, and attention in a place like this was never a gift. The assembly hall smelled of tallow smoke and damp wool, and something older beneath it, stone that had absorbed decades of sentences handed down without mercy. She breathed through her mouth, just barely, and kept her eyes at a level that communicated neither defiance nor submission. A careful angle she had practiced without ever admitting she was practicing it. 23 council members arranged themselves along the curved stone dais at the front of the hall. Elder Dorne sat at the center, his robes pressed into precise folds, his expression carrying the particular flatness of a man who had already decided before he arrived. On either side of him, the other elders settled into position with the unhurried ease of wolves who knew the outcome and were simply waiting for the ritual to complete itself. The hall was full. That surprised her slightly. She had expected witnesses, procedure required them, but not this many. Wolves pressed along the walls 3 deep, their bodies still, their scent carrying the metallic undercurrent of collective attention. She recognized faces she knew, the quartermaster who had always looked past her in the corridor, the 2 senior healers who had taken her work without crediting it, the young guards who would not meet her eyes now either. No one moved toward her. She noted this without surprise, without the hot surge of betrayal. She had already processed that particular grief years ago, quietly, in the dark of the healer's quarters, when she was 17 and too old to cry without shame. What she felt now was simpler, cleaner, a kind of clarity that arrived when the outcome narrowed. She had counted the council members when they filed in. She had been counting since. Lillian Stormhaven, Elder Dorne's voice carried without effort, shaped for rooms like this one. You stand before this council on charges of falsifying territorial records. How do you answer? She kept her hands loose at her sides. I have not falsified anything. The word anything was deliberate. She chose words the way she chose footholds on unfamiliar ground, testing weight before committing. Elder Dorne's expression did not shift. The records in question detail bloodline registrations from the last 2 decades. Several entries have been altered. Your handwriting has been identified in the margins. My handwriting was used to correct clerical errors that predated my involvement. She paused. The originals are still present in the archive. The corrections are notated with dates. A murmur moved through the room, brief, quickly suppressed. She understood what the murmur meant. It meant that at least some people in this hall knew she was not wrong. It also meant they would vote as instructed regardless. Elder Dorne folded his hands on the stone surface before him. The council has reviewed the materials. We have reached our determination. He turned slightly, a practiced gesture, pulling the room's attention to the row of elders. We will proceed to formal vote. Here it is, she thought, Not fear exactly, more like the sensation of a tide going out, the strange quiet before the pull. She began to count. The first vote came from Elder Wrath at the far left, a man she had treated twice for a recurring joint ailment, who had thanked her both times with the particular warmth of someone who believed gratitude was its own currency. His hand rose for Exile without hesitation. 1. The second elder voted before the first had finished raising his hand. 2. By the time the fifth vote had been cast, the silence in the hall had shifted quality. It was not uncomfortable silence, it was expectant silence, the kind that gathered around an outcome already understood. 6, 7, 8. Lillian's jaw was level, she breathed evenly. She had heard the expression blood ran cold used to describe moments like this, and she had always found it imprecise, because what she actually felt was nothing like cold. It was a quieting, a settling of all the noise inside her into something thin and manageable. She calculated, she observed, she did not panic. If you've ever held your breath waiting for someone to tell you whether you're allowed to keep existing, stay with this channel. Because what happens in this vote is only the beginning of what's coming. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever stood alone in a room where everyone had already decided? 9, 10. Halfway through the row, and not one abstention. Mara had warned her, 3 days ago in the corridor outside the kitchen, with flour still dusting her forearms. Mara Vexley had pressed her lips together in a thin line and said, "They're going to make it official. You need to run." Lillian had said nothing, which Mara had correctly interpreted as refusal. Mara had stayed anyway. Lillian had not run because running would confirm what the accusations implied, that she had something to hide. She did have something to hide, but it was not what they claimed, and she was not prepared to abandon it. 11, 12, 13. She let her gaze drift briefly to the high windows. Pale winter light pressed through them, thin and white, doing nothing to warm the stone. Outside, the forest edge would be visible from the upper battlements, the tree line where Exile began, where exiled wolves were left with nothing and no shelter, and the knowledge that no pack would take them in. Exile was not a punishment designed for survival. Everyone in this room understood that. 14, 15. Her scar itched beneath her collar. She did not reach for it. 16, 17, 18. 3 members remained. She studied their faces without appearing to. The first had served with Elder Dorne for 2 decades. His vote was not in question. The second was younger, recently elevated, with the careful political instincts of someone who understood that survival meant reading the room correctly before raising a hand. He voted for Exile. 19. The second to last elder paused, a pause long enough to register. Lillian watched the small movement of his throat and understood it for what it was, not courage, not even conscience, just the momentary friction of a decision that required something of him. He voted for Exile. 20. 1 remaining. Elder Sorvath at the end of the row was 73 years old, and he had known her parents before they were executed. He had been present at her mother's trial. He had voted for her Exile then, too, and had never once acknowledged it in the 18 years since. His hand rose slowly, deliberately. 21. 2 members abstained, neither spoke. 21 votes. Out of 23 present, not one voice raised in her defense. The math was simple, and the math was total, and Lillian stood in the center of the assembly hall and let the numbers settle into her without expression. Elder Dorne rose from his seat. The council of this territory, by majority vote, he paused for the breath that gave the words their weight, finds Lillian Stormhaven guilty of bloodline record falsification and sentences her to exile from these lands, effective by sundown. The hall did not erupt. There was no dramatic noise, just a slow exhalation of held tension, the room releasing the breath it had been holding, and underneath it, the shuffling of feet and bodies rearranging around a decided thing. If your chest is tight right now, if you need to know that this isn't the end, follow this channel, because the vote has just been counted, and someone is about to walk through that door and unmake every single number. Leave a comment. What would you have done if you were Lillian, standing alone with 21 hands raised against you? Lillian held very still. She calculated. Sundown gave her approximately 4 hours. The archive was a 12-minute walk. She knew which records she needed and exactly where they were stored, wrapped in oilcloth inside a false section of the lower shelf. She could carry them in a satchel beneath her outer layer. She could reach the forest edge by a route that avoided the main corridor. She was not planning to simply walk into the forest and die. She was planning to. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. Not the small side entrance used for witnesses and accused parties. The main doors. Both panels, simultaneously, pushed wide by the kind of force that suggested no one had been asked to open them. The sound echoed off stone before anyone turned to look. Then they turned. She's not going anywhere, she's mine. The voice did not fill the room the way shouting fills a room. It displaced it. 3 words before the sentence had finished, and the council members who had been reaching for parchment had gone completely still, hands suspended mid-motion, as though the sound had interrupted some signal between their brains and their bodies. Elder Dorne, still standing, had turned, and then stopped turning. His mouth was open at an angle that had intended to form a word and had simply forgotten how. Lillian felt the change in the room before she fully processed the words. She had been calculating her route to the archive. She had been measuring the distance between herself and the side entrance, noting which guards were positioned closest to the corridor, estimating how many seconds she had before anyone thought to physically restrain her. And then the air in the hall changed, the way pressure changes before a storm, not in temperature, but in weight, and every calculation dissolved. She turned slowly. She had learned not to snap towards sudden sounds. Snapping communicated fear. He stood in the open doorway, and the winter light came through behind him and did something strange to the edges of his silhouette, not dramatic, not cinematic, just the flat physics of a large body blocking a significant amount of light. He had not entered fully yet. He stood with one hand still on the door panel, not gripping it, just resting there, the way a man rests his hand on something when he has decided the room will come to him. The wolves nearest the entrance had moved. Not away exactly. It was subtler than retreat. They had simply redistributed their weight, shifted back an inch, 2 inches, recalibrating without apparent awareness that they were doing it. The guard to the left of the main entrance had straightened so abruptly that his shoulder plate had audibly clicked. He was staring at a fixed point approximately 6 inches above the visitor's head, which was the posture of someone who desperately wanted not to be noticed, making eye contact. Lillian noted all of this in approximately 4 seconds. Then she looked at him directly. His black hair held faint silver at the temples, and the scar that ran from his jaw to his throat caught the pale light at an angle that made it look like something carved rather than healed. Amber eyes moved through the room once, a single measured sweep, unhurried, the kind of assessment that missed nothing and acknowledged everything, and then they stopped. On hers. She did not look away. She almost did. The instinct to lower her eyes was strong and old and deeply trained, and she recognized it for what it was, the reflex of someone who had survived by becoming ignorable. She was not, at this moment, ignorable. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, long enough to register that she had done it deliberately, and then moved her attention back to the council. Because she needed to think, and she could not think and look at him at the same time, and she was not prepared to examine why. A warmth had settled at the base of her sternum that she did not recognize and did not welcome. She attributed it to the sudden change in air pressure from the doors opening and moved on. Elder Dorne found his voice. It was not the voice he had been using. That voice had been smooth, calibrated, the voice of a man managing an outcome. This one was 2 shades thinner. Alpha King Ashenmore, this assembly was not. We did not receive notice of. You received a summons 3 weeks ago. The Alpha King had entered the hall now fully, and the door behind him had swung to a partial close. He had not closed it deliberately. The momentum of his entry had simply done it. For a territorial audit, I am completing it. The audit pertains to administrative records. This is a council proceeding. The council proceeding pertains to bloodline records. He had stopped walking at a distance from the dais that required Elder Dorne to look at him without looking down at him, a specific distance, Lillian registered, chosen to level the exchange without appearing to. That falls under territorial audit jurisdiction, as of this morning. Elder Dorne's fingers had found the edge of the stone dais. His knuckles, Lillian noticed, had gone pale. She watched his hands rather than his face, because hands were harder to control. The hall had gone from expectant silence to a different quality of silence entirely, the kind that arrived when a room full of hierarchically wired creatures simultaneously recalculated who the most dominant presence was and came to the same unanimous conclusion. She could feel it in the air around her, that collective adjustment, like wolves in a forest all turning to face the same direction at once. She understood from a purely political standpoint what had just occurred. She understood that the Alpha King's jurisdiction, invoked correctly, could supersede a council vote. She understood that the words he had spoken, "She's not going anywhere, she's mine," were legally specific in a pact structure, a claim of authority over an individual, removing them from local council jurisdiction. She understood all of this. What she did not understand, and refused to speculate about in a room full of people watching her face for a reaction, was why. Elder Dorne had recovered enough to straighten his spine. The Exile has been formally voted, 21-2. The Exile is suspended. 2 words, final. The way a door closes when the person closing it is not angry, but has simply decided the conversation is done. My lord, with respect, the jurisdictional claim requires. Kale. A man had entered the hall so quietly behind the Alpha King that Lillian had not registered his arrival. He was leaner than his Alpha, with watchful dark eyes and the particular stillness of someone trained to observe rather than act until given cause. He moved to Elder Dorne and placed a rolled document on the dais with a precision that suggested every motion he made was considered. Elder Dorne looked at the document. Something in his face changed, a flattening, a compression, as though the expression beneath his public face had shifted half an inch closer to the surface. He did not open the scroll. He did not need to, Lillian suspected. He already knew what it contained. The Alpha King turned then and looked at her again, and this time there was no sweep of the room preceding it. He simply looked at her the way a person looks at something they have already been thinking about, direct, without the performance of discovery. Lillian kept her expression level. Her hands were still loose at her sides. She would not clasp them. Clasped hands read as either prayer or supplication, and she intended neither. She breathed through the strange pressure in her chest, the warmth she had not asked for and could not account for. And she met his gaze with the particular steadiness she had developed over years of being looked at by people who expected her to flinch. She did not flinch. Something in the quality of his attention shifted slightly, barely, not enough for anyone else in the room to read. A fractional easing at the corners, an almost imperceptible adjustment. She filed it away without interpreting it, because she could not afford to interpret it incorrectly. "You'll come with me," he said, not a question, not quite an order, something in between that assumed compliance without demanding it, the linguistic equivalent of a door held open that would not remain open indefinitely. Every instinct Lillian had cultivated for survival told her to agree. Agreement with authority had kept her alive for 8 years. Agreement cost less than resistance. Agreement was the architecture of her continued existence inside this pack. She agreed, but she did not nod immediately. She took one breath, a full one, deliberate, and let the room see that she had taken it. Then she said quietly, "I'll need to retrieve something from the healer's quarters first." The Alpha King regarded her for a moment, just one. "Kale will accompany you." It was not a concession, she understood that. It was a management decision, immediate and practical, the kind made by someone accustomed to containing variables. But it was also, she noted, not a refusal. He had not said no. He had not overridden her single stated condition. She nodded once, Then I'm ready. Around her, the hall was still holding its collective breath. Elder Dorne stood at the dais with the unopened scroll under his hand and an expression that belonged to a man watching something he had carefully arranged come unmade by a force he had not accounted for. The wolves along the walls had not moved. The guards had not moved. If you need to know what she has hidden in those healers' quarters, what she's been protecting all these years, then do not leave this channel, because she is about to walk out of this hall carrying the only thing that can either save her or destroy her completely. Subscribe right now and drop a comment. Whose side do you think Kale is really on? She did not look at Elder Dorne as she turned toward the side corridor. She did not look at the council, or the witnesses, or the wolves pressed 3 deep along the walls who had all raised their hands or stayed silent when her life was on the table. She looked at the door she was walking toward. Behind her, she heard the Alpha King's footsteps on stone, unhurried, even the rhythm of someone who had already decided how this would end and was simply allowing events to arrive at the conclusion in their own time. She did not know what he wanted. She did not know why her name was apparently worth superseding a 21-vote council majority. She did not know, and she was not the kind of person who made decisions about trust based on insufficient information, and she would not start now simply because a man with amber eyes had walked through a door and said words that had, without her permission, changed the air in the room. She was not saved, she was transferred. And whatever came next, she would face it the same way she had faced everything else in her life. Already counting. He had memorized the way she lowered her eyes before anyone could meet them. Not as submission, he had seen submission, knew its particular collapse of the shoulders, the way the neck bent degrees past comfort. This was different. This was management. She lowered her eyes the way a soldier sheathes a weapon before entering a room where weapons were not permitted, deliberately, strategically, with full knowledge of what she was putting away and why. Broderick had been watching Lillian Stormhaven for 4 months. Not in person, through records, through reports, through the careful reconstruction of a life assembled from fragments that other people had tried to erase. He had learned her in the way he learned most things that mattered, methodically, without sentiment, building a picture from evidence rather than impression. But today, he had learned something the records had not told him. She had held his gaze. 2 seconds, deliberate. A woman who had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing had looked directly at the Alpha King in a room of 23 hostile council members and held the contact long enough to signal that it was chosen. He filed that away without reaction, the way he filed everything. Kale fell into step beside him as they crossed the outer corridor, their pace matched without discussion, a habit of 8 years working together. She asked to retrieve something, Kale said, quiet, factual. I know. She didn't hesitate when she asked, no calculation before it. The decision was already made. Broderick said nothing. He had noted the same thing. She had taken a breath, visible, deliberate, performed for the room, and then stated her condition without flinching. Most people granted an unexpected rescue spent the first 60 seconds in a state of disoriented gratitude that made them compliant and slightly irrational. She had spent those 60 seconds assessing and then negotiating. He found this deeply unsurprising. The records he had reviewed across 6 territories over the past year all pointed to the same shape of person. Someone who had learned that safety was not given, only arranged. Someone who had been useful for so long that usefulness had become identity. And underneath all of it, buried beneath years of deliberate erasure by people who had excellent reasons to erase it, a bloodline that changed the political architecture of the Northern Territories entirely. She was the last surviving heir of the Stormhaven royal line. Not a minor branch, not a collateral connection. Direct descent, maternal line, suppressed in the records through a series of falsifications that dated back 22 years. Falsifications made by Elder Dorne and 2 council members who were no longer living. The records Lillian had been accused of falsifying were, in fact, the corrections. She had found the originals. She had quietly, carefully, without telling anyone, begun restoring what had been deliberately erased. She had been doing this alone for years. And she still did not know what she was restoring, or why it mattered, or what her own name meant in the language of pack law. Broderick slowed his pace at the junction of the corridor. Through the narrow window in the stone, the forest edge was visible, pine dark against a white sky, the tree line where Exile began. He looked at it for a moment. He had made the decision to intervene before he entered the hall. He had made it 3 weeks ago, when Cale's report confirmed that the council intended to move against her before the audit reached its conclusions. He had moved up his timeline. What he had not anticipated was the precise quality of her stillness when the votes were counted. 21 hands raised against her, and she had stood with her jaw level and her hands open at her sides and counted. He had watched from the anteroom through the iron grate. He had watched her count each vote and recalibrate and keep counting, not performing composure, actually composed. Quiet resilience, something in him noted, and he shut that observation down immediately. This was political. She was critical infrastructure for everything he was trying to rebuild across the territories. Her bloodline, properly documented and publicly established, would legitimate the restructuring of the council system in ways that pure authority could not. She was necessary. He repeated this to himself with the deliberate firmness of someone who knew they were arguing against their own instincts. Cale was watching him with the particular expression that meant he had drawn a conclusion he would not voice, unless asked directly. "Don't," Broderick said. "I haven't said anything. You were about to say something precise and irritating." Cale considered. "I was going to observe that she looked at you the way people look at a locked door they're already calculating how to open." Broderick resumed walking. "She's cautious. She's intelligent. There's a difference, a beat. She doesn't trust you. She shouldn't. She doesn't know me. She also," Cale added, at the exact cadence of someone finishing a thought they had been holding, "didn't thank you." Broderick said nothing. It was true. In the hall, when the Exile was suspended and the document placed before Elder Dorne, she had not said thank you. She had taken her breath and stated her condition and nodded once. Clean, transactional. The behavior of someone who had learned that gratitude was a form of debt, and debt was a form of vulnerability. He respected it. He did not examine the fact that he respected it. She would learn the truth about her bloodline. He would tell her when the documentation was complete and the legal architecture was in place to protect her from what the knowledge would make her. A target, a symbol, a threat to everyone who had benefited from the erasure. She would not be grateful for that information either, he suspected. She would be furious. She would calculate. She would look at him with those storm-gray eyes and begin immediately determining what he wanted from her and whether she could afford to let him have it. He was, he noted, with the same clinical detachment he applied to most things, already looking forward to it. He did not examine that either. The parchment crackled under her fingers, louder than it should have been. Lillian smoothed the edge without looking up. The War Hall's working table was broad and cold, stone-topped, the kind of surface designed for maps and strategy rather than the careful review of archived documents. She had arranged the records into 3 columns, verified originals left, suspect entries center, her own corrections right, with the precise organization of someone who needed the work to speak clearly because she could not. He was across the table. Not close, 6 feet of stone between them, which should have been sufficient. It was the same distance she maintained from the senior healers when presenting case records, the same distance she used in any professional exchange where she needed to be taken seriously without being perceived as challenging. A calibrated distance. It felt insufficient. She noted this and set it aside. The War Hall smelled of leather and cold iron, and something beneath both, wood smoke from a fire that had burned down to coals in the far grate. Outside the narrow windows, the sky had gone the particular gray of late afternoon pressing toward dark. They had been working for 2 hours. Cale had been present for the first 40 minutes. then excused himself for reasons that were professionally stated and that Lillian had chosen not to examine. Now it was the two of them and 30 years of corrupted records. This entry, she turned a page toward him without sliding it across. He would have to lean forward to read it or ask her to move it, and either action would tell her something. The date of registration has been altered. The original ink is still visible if you hold it at an angle. He leaned forward. She focused on the parchment. In her peripheral vision, she registered the specific detail of his hands on the table edge, the controlled placement, the scar across the back of his right hand that matched nothing in any patrol report she had read, which meant it predated his recorded service. She filed this without reacting to it and kept her attention on the document. The substituted date places the birth 4 years later than it occurred, she continued, which would make the child a minor at the time of the parents' trial. A minor cannot inherit lineage status under PAC law, which means the bloodline claim would expire. Silence. She looked up. He was not looking at the document. He was looking at her. Not with the flat assessment he had used in the assembly hall. Something had shifted in it, a degree of attention that was less survey and more focus, the difference between a general scan and a deliberate choice about where to rest the eye. He caught himself, she watched it happen, the precise moment of self-correction, and returned his gaze to the parchment. "You've known about this entry for some time," he said. It was not a question. "I found it 14 months ago," she said. "And you corrected it." "I notated the discrepancy. I didn't alter the original." A pause. "I understand the difference." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, fractional, gone before it completed. She looked back at the records. The warmth at the base of her sternum, which she had attributed to the fire's residual heat, had not diminished despite the fire having burned to coals an hour ago. She was aware of this with the detached attention of someone cataloging a symptom they did not intend to report. "The child named in this entry," she said, keeping her voice even, "there's no death record." "No." Which means either the records were further altered, or the child survived. She set down the page she was holding, slowly, deliberately. She had known this. She had known it for 14 months, had sat with the implication of it in the dark of the healer's quarters and turned it over and decided, repeatedly, that it was not her business to pursue, that pursuing it would cost more than the answer was worth. She had told herself this with the conviction of someone who suspected they were lying. "Do you know who the child is?" she asked. A pause, 3 full seconds. "Yes," he said. She waited for him to continue. He did not. The fire settled in the grate with a soft collapse of embers, and the sound of it was the only sound in the hall, and she sat across 6 feet of cold stone from a man who knew the answer to a question she had been refusing to ask for over a year, and she understood with total clarity that he was not going to give it to her tonight. Not yet. He was going to make her wait, not cruelly, not as punishment, but with the patience of someone managing a sequence of events that required each piece in its correct order. She recognized the strategy because she used it herself. She gathered the documents back into their columns, verified, suspect, corrected. Her hands were steady. "Same time tomorrow," she said, not a question. "Yes." She stood and he stood, simultaneously, without either prompting the other, and she registered this only after it had happened, the small unconscious synchrony of it, and she did not know what to do with that, so she did nothing. She picked up the oilcloth-wrapped records from beneath the table where she had placed them on arrival. He watched her take them without comment. "If you need to know what's in that oilcloth, what she's been protecting at the cost of everything, then this channel is where you stay, because she's getting closer to the truth and so is he, and one of them is going to reach it first. Subscribe and tell me, does she already know it's her?" She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard him remain standing. She did not look back. The missing page smelled faintly of smoke. Not wood smoke, not the soft residual kind that clung to the war hall's stone after a cold night. This was the specific, acrid trace of something burned with intention, paper consumed quickly, at high heat, recently enough that the smell had not yet fully left the surrounding documents. Lillian set down the folder. She did not move for a moment, just stood in the archive corridor with the smell reaching her and the gap in the sequence where page 47 should have been, and let her mind run the implications quietly, without hurry, the way she had learned to think through anything that frightened her. Someone had been here. The archive was not widely accessible. Healer's clearance and council authority were the two entry points, and she held one and had never been granted the other officially. She had been accessing this section for 14 months through a key she was not supposed to have, given to her 3 years ago by the previous head archivist 2 days before he died. She had told no one about the key. She had told no one about what she had found. She checked the oilcloth bundle on the lower shelf. Still there, undisturbed. She pressed 2 fingers to its surface, confirming the shape of the documents inside, and felt the particular quality of relief that was mostly composed of postponed dread. They hadn't found these yet. She replaced the folder with the missing page and stood very still, rethinking the last 4 days. Who had noticed her entering the archive? Who had been positioned to observe the corridor? Who among the council members still present in the territory had both the access and the motive to begin removing evidence? Elder Dorne. She had watched his face when the Alpha King placed the scroll before him. She had watched his knuckles on the dais edge, the controlled compression of a man absorbing something that threatened him. He had spent 22 years building a particular version of the Pack's history. He was not going to allow it to be unmade quietly. She picked up the oilcloth bundle and tucked it inside her outer layer. She was not leaving it here. The walk from the archive to the war hall took 11 minutes through the main corridor. She took the eastern passage instead, adding 4 minutes, removing 3 potential observation points. She counted doorways. She noted which were open and which were closed. She passed 2 wolves she recognized and kept her pace even and her expression unremarkable, and neither of them looked at her with anything beyond the usual detached non-acknowledgement she had always received from pack members of higher rank. She could not tell if that was normal or performed. This was the problem with being systematically ignored for years. When the ignoring became surveillance, it looked identical from the inside. Cale was outside the war hall when she arrived. He straightened slightly when he saw her, not surprise, but a recalibration, the way someone moves when an expected variable arrives ahead of schedule. "I need to speak with him," she said. "He's... Now, please." A pause, brief, then Cale opened the door. Broderick was at the far end of the table with a spread of territorial maps, and he looked up when she entered with the same quality of attention he always brought, immediate, complete, missing nothing. His eyes moved to the shape beneath her outer layer where the oilcloth bundle sat pressed against her ribs, and back to her face. She placed the bundle on the table. "Page 47 of the secondary bloodline register has been removed and burned," she said. "Within the last 24 hours, someone with council access or above." He did not look surprised. "This registered." "You knew the records were being interfered with," she said, "not an accusation. A data point, stated plainly, because she needed to know how much of what she thought she understood had actually been managed." "I knew it was likely." A pause. "I didn't know the timeline had accelerated." "What was on page 47? 3 seconds. She was beginning to know his silences by their length. 3 seconds meant he was deciding not how much to tell her, but in what order. "A birth registration," he said, "cross-reference to a lineage entry that has already been extracted from the primary record." "The same child?" "Yes." She put both hands flat on the table, not aggressive, grounding. She needed the cold solidity of the stone under her palms while she said the next thing. "They're not trying to exile me anymore," she said. "Exile was containment. This is elimination," he said, quiet, precise, The word dropped into the room and stayed there. She had known it before she said it. Knowing and hearing, it confirmed occupied different places in the body. She breathed through the difference. Then I can't stay in the healer's quarters, she said. No. And the records, she looked at the oilcloth, if they find these. They won't. He had moved while she was looking at the documents, one step, then stopped, as though catching the motion and reconsidering. He was closer than 6 feet now, 5 perhaps. She could see the fine detail of the scar along his jaw. You'll move to the secured wing tonight. Kale will arrange it. If you felt that shift in distance and wondered if he felt it too, follow this channel right now, because she is still thinking about the records and he is running out of reasons to keep his distance. Subscribe and drop a comment. What does she do when she finally finds out it's her name on that page? She picked up the oilcloth. She was not leaving it on his table either. She did not know him well enough for that. She did not know if she would ever know anyone well enough for that, and she was aware this was a problem specific to her rather than to him, and she set the thought aside for later. Tonight, she said. Tonight, he confirmed. She turned for the door. The 5 feet of distance between them, when she left it, felt different from 6. She did not examine why. Her name looked different written in his hand. Not her common name, her full name, the name she had been given at birth and had never once heard spoken aloud in its complete form, because the people who knew it had been executed and the people who remained had reasons to forget it. Lillian Vale, Stormhaven. The Vale was the part she had not known. She sat with the document in the secured wing's small reading room, the oilcloth open beside her, and looked at the name until it stopped looking like hers and started looking like something that belonged to someone else. Someone older, someone built for rooms she had never been permitted to enter, someone whose existence had apparently threatened enough people that an entire council had spent 22 years carefully erasing the evidence of it. Broderick stood at the window, not watching her, giving her the specific courtesy of not watching her, which she registered and was, unexpectedly, grateful for. Vale, she said, her voice came out level, she had not been certain it would. The founding lineage of the Northern Territories. He did not turn, before the current council structure, before the hierarchy as it exists now. The Vale line held authority that was not granted by council vote, it was structural, written into the original territorial compact. She looked at the document again. That compact still exists, she said. Yes, and if the heir to the Vale line were to invoke it, the current council structure would be legally subordinate to that authority. He turned then. Every decision made in the last 22 years without Vale acknowledgement could be contested. Every exile, every execution. The word execution landed in the specific place she had been carefully not touching since she understood where this was going. Her parents. She set the document down, flat, precise, the way she set down instruments in the healer's quarters when she needed her hands free to think. She breathed once, fully, and looked at the middle distance and let the shape of the last 24 years rearrange itself around this new information. Her parents had not been executed for traitorous blood. They had been executed because their blood was the most legitimate claim in the territory, and someone had needed that claim gone. Dorne, she said. He drafted the falsification order. 2 others signed it. Both are dead. He moved from the window to the table, not sitting, standing at the corner, close enough for the conversation to be private, far enough to give her the room she needed. He has been managing the erasure since before you arrived in this pack. He took me in, the words felt strange. After the execution, he argued for it before the council. I always assumed, she stopped, reassembled. He needed me inside the pack where he could monitor the records I might access. Yes. He needed me close enough to watch and low enough in status that no one would listen if I found something. Yes. She looked at him directly. And you, 4 months of surveillance. You needed the heir to the Vale line alive and documented before you could restructure the council legally. Without me, The compact has no standing claimant. 3 seconds. Yes, he said. She appreciated the honesty. She did not say so. Instead, she looked back at the document, at her name in his handwriting, at the veil she had not known she carried, and she thought about the archive key the old archivist had pressed into her hand 2 days before he died. She thought about whether that had been accidental. She thought about a dying man who had known exactly what she was and had given her the only tool available to him. She thought about 14 months of careful, solitary restoration work and understood now that she had been reconstructing her own erasure without knowing it. Something tightened in her chest that was not the warmth she had been dismissing for days. This was older, sharper, the specific grief of realizing that your entire survival strategy had been someone else's containment plan. She had been useful, she had always been useful, she had believed usefulness was the thing she chose. It had been chosen for her. Roderick had gone very still in the way she had come to recognize as his version of careful attention, not stillness from disengagement, but from the deliberate suppression of response. He was watching her process and not intervening, and she understood that this too was a form of management, and she was too exhausted by the understanding to resent it properly. What happens now, she said, not a question, a prompt for information she needed. The compact is invoked with your signature and 2 witnesses. It supersedes the council immediately. Dorne loses all legal authority. He paused. But the moment it's filed, every person who has benefited from the erasure will know you're alive and documented and dangerous to them. I'm already a target. You'll be a more specific one. She nodded once, slowly. She picked up the document. She read her full name one more time. The veil she had not known. The lineage that had gotten her parents killed and herself erased and had spent 22 years waiting inside falsified records for someone to find it. She had found it, alone, without knowing what she was looking for. She set it back down without signing. Not because she wouldn't, because she needed one night with the weight of it before she put her name to something irreversible. She had learned that from the records themselves. Decisions made in haste left traces that took decades to correct. Tomorrow, she said. He picked up the document and held it and did not argue. Tomorrow, he said. The sound of boots behind her didn't match the rhythm of patrols. Lillian knew the patrol rhythm. She had memorized it the first week she arrived in the secured wing, 4 guards, rotating at 20-minute intervals, the eastward pair always slightly ahead of schedule because the older guard set the pace and he favored his left knee on cold mornings. She had noted this without deciding to note it, the way she noted most things that might one day constitute the difference between a good outcome and a bad one. The boots behind her were off by 6 seconds. She did not break stride. The corridor from the reading room to the secured quarters was 43 steps on a normal night. She counted them every time without appearing to count them. She was on step 19. The document was inside her outer layer, pressed flat against her ribs alongside the oilcloth bundle. She had not left either in the reading room. She had not left anything anywhere that she could not carry. Step 22. 2 sets of boots now. The second had joined from the side corridor at the junction she had just passed, which meant they had been positioned before she left the reading room, which meant this was not opportunistic. She kept her breathing even. She had 4 options and approximately 8 steps to select one. The door to the secured quarters required a key she held. Getting through, it would take 6 seconds minimum. 6 seconds was too long with 2 people behind her and unknown positioning ahead. She discarded that option without sentiment. The side passage at step 31 led to the lower kitchen corridor, which connected to the outer storage yard. The yard had 2 exits. She knew both. She had walked them twice in the past 3 days with the specific attention of someone hoping she was being paranoid. She had not been paranoid. Step 28. She turned at step 30 without breaking pace, as though it were her intended direction, and moved into the side passage. If your pulse just spiked, stay on this channel, because she hasn't panicked once and she's been counting steps this whole time, and what she does in the next 60 seconds is going to tell you everything about who she really is. Drop a comment. Did you think she'd run or fight? The side passage was narrower. She used this. Narrower meant one person at a time behind her, which converted two pursuers into a sequence rather than a simultaneous problem. She heard the pace behind her accelerate. They had registered the direction change and abandoned pretense, and she processed the sound of it practically, noting the weight of footfall, estimating size, calculating. The first was heavier, slower acceleration. The second was lighter and faster and would reach her first. She reached the storage alcove at the passage's midpoint and stopped. Not because she had run out of options, because stopping was the option. She pressed flat to the alcove's interior wall in the dark and waited with the specific patience of someone who had learned that the most effective response to being chased was occasionally to simply not be where the chaser expected. The lighter pursuer came through first at a pace designed for pursuit, not inspection. He passed the alcove by 2 full steps before registering she was not ahead of him. She was already moving. She came out of the alcove low, drove her forearm into the back of his knee with the precise force the head healer had taught her for patient transfers, a technique designed to lower a large body safely, which worked equally well for other purposes, and he went down onto the stone with the particular surprise of someone whose body has acted before their mind caught up. She took the key from his belt without stopping. Not his key, hers, removed earlier, she registered, which told her they had accessed the secured wing through coordination with someone holding internal authority. Dorne, the second pursuer, had rounded the passage corner. She threw the first man's key at the far end of the corridor, a clean arc, metal-catching faint torchlight, and moved in the opposite direction while his attention tracked the sound. 3 seconds, enough. She reached the lower kitchen corridor at a walk, not a run, because running in a wolf pack's territory at night communicated prey, and she was not prey, and she had learned the distinction mattered even when, especially when, her body was suggesting otherwise. The kitchen was empty. The outer yard door was bolted from the inside. She drew the bolt, stepped through, and pulled it closed behind her. Cold air, pine resin, the smell of the territory at night, watchful and dark. She did not stop moving. The yard's eastern exit opened onto the path toward the war hall. She took it, because the war hall was the one place in this territory she knew contained someone with both the authority and the specific motivation to care whether she arrived. She did not examine the particulars of that motivation. She examined the path. If you need to know he's already awake, already moving, follow this channel right now, because she just saved herself and he is about to find out, and his reaction is going to be the least controlled thing you have seen from him yet. Subscribe and drop a comment. What does she say when she walks through that door? The war hall doors were heavy. She pushed the left one open with both hands and stepped inside. Broderick was standing at the table. Not seated, not reviewing documents. Standing, with Kale beside him and a territorial map spread between them, and the particular quality of attention in the room that suggested the conversation had been about her and had been happening for some time. He looked at her. His amber eyes moved across her in a single pass, checking, she understood, with the clinical efficiency of someone running an inventory. His jaw was tight. His hands, she noted, were flat on the table in a way that read less like casual placement and more like a decision about where to put them. She recognized, all right. She had known this since the kitchen corridor. It was useful to confirm it in someone else's expression. They had internal access, she said. Someone gave them my key. She placed the document on the table, unsigned, intact. I'm ready to sign it now, she said. The silence this time felt different, waiting, not judging. Lillian noticed it before she noticed anything else. The assembly hall held the same stone walls, the same tallow smoke, the same press of bodies along the edges, but the quality of the attention had changed. 3 days ago, this room had exhaled relief when her exile was confirmed. Today it was holding its breath for a different reason, not the anticipation of an outcome already decided, but the rarer, more uncomfortable tension of a room that did not know what came next. She stood at the center. Same position, same stone floor. She had noted this deliberately when she took her place, that she was standing in the precise location where she had counted 21 votes against her survival, and that her legs were steady, and that she had chosen to stand here rather than slightly to the left, where the footing was marginally better. Some choices were not practical. She allowed herself those occasionally. Broderick stood to her right, one step back, not in front of her, not between her and the council, one step back and to the right, which placed him in her peripheral vision without removing her from the room's primary sight line. She had noticed this positioning when he took it and had not said anything, because there was nothing to say. It was correct, and she suspected he knew it was correct, and stating the obvious was not something either of them did. Elder Dorne sat at the center of the council dais. He had been informed of the compact's invocation at dawn. He had arrived at the assembly with the expression of a man who had spent the intervening hours constructing a position and had found, by arrival, that every angle was blocked. His hands were still. His face was composed. Only the specific flatness behind his eyes communicated what the composure was costing him. Kale stepped forward and placed the compact on the dais, then her signed document beside it, then the restored bloodline register, complete, corrected, every falsification annotated in her precise handwriting with dates and original source comparisons. 22 years of erasure, reconstructed, in order. The hall was very quiet. If you have been waiting for this moment since Chapter 1, stay on this channel, because she is standing in the same room where they counted her out, and not one hand is raised against her now. Drop a comment. How does it feel to watch the room change around her? Elder Dorne looked at the documents for a long time, then he looked at her. This compact, he said, with the careful enunciation of a man testing the weight of each word before committing to it, requires independent verification of the lineage claim before it can be. It has been verified, Broderick's voice, not loud, by the Alpha King's office under Territorial Audit Authority. The verification is the third document in that stack. Read the seal. Dorne looked at the seal. He did not argue further. The room exhaled, not relief, not joy, something more complicated, the sound of a collective understanding arriving. Broderick turned to her then, and what she saw in his expression was not triumph. It was not even satisfaction. It was the specific quality of attention he had given her across the table in the war hall, focused, deliberate, except that here, in front of witnesses, he was not suppressing it. I want to be precise, he said, about what I am offering and what I am not. She had not expected that opening. She kept her expression level and listened. I claimed you in this hall 3 days ago to remove you from the council's jurisdiction. That claim was legal and it was necessary, and I am not withdrawing it. He paused. But necessity is not the whole of it, and you deserve to know the difference. Around them, the hall was entirely still. You rebuilt your own record alone, without knowing what you were rebuilding, for 14 months. You found what trained investigators had missed for 2 decades. You walked out of an attack 2 nights ago and arrived at my door with the document intact and signed it standing up. He stopped. I am not declaring ownership. I am declaring recognition. Those are different things. What happens next is your choice. She held his gaze. 2 seconds, then 3. The length she had chosen in this same room when she had looked at him across 21 raised hands, except that now there was no performance in it, no signal to send, no room to manage. Just the two of them inside the public moment and the particular stillness of a decision being made in real time. If you felt that land somewhere specific in your chest, follow this channel right now, because she hasn't answered yet and the room is still waiting, and what she says is going to be entirely her own. Subscribe and drop a comment. What would you say? She looked at Elder Dorne first. She looked at him for exactly long enough to let him understand that she saw him clearly, not with anger, not with the particular satisfaction of reversal, but with the flat recognition of someone who had finished calculating and arrived at an answer. He had spent 22 years managing her into invisibility. She had spent 14 months, without knowing it, undoing him. Then she turned back to Broderick. "I know the difference," she said. "I've known it since the war hall." She stepped forward. Not toward him, alongside him. One step that placed her at his left, with the same distance he had taken from her. One step back now rendered parallel. The positioning said what she intended without requiring further translation. She was not behind him. She was not in front of him. She was beside him, in the assembly hall, in front of every witness who had watched her counted out, and she was standing on steady ground. He did not move to close the remaining distance. He did not need to. The room understood, and this time its understanding was not the cold exhalation of an outcome managed. It was something quieter and more permanent, and entirely without mercy for the man sitting at the center of the dais, with 22 years of careful work dissolving under a third document and its unbroken seal. The hall smelled cleaner without them. Lillian noticed it the morning after, walking the same corridor, past the same stone archways, and registering the absence of something that had been so constant she had stopped identifying it as a smell and had simply filed it under here. The particular tension scent of wolves managing fear beneath authority. The sharp undercurrent of a hierarchy held together by pressure rather than agreement. It was gone. Not entirely. Hierarchy did not dissolve overnight, and she was not naive enough to expect it to. But the specific quality of it had changed, the way a room changes when the person who had been controlling it leaves, and the remaining people slowly remember how to breathe at their own pace. Elder Dorne had been removed from council authority at the close of the assembly. Cale had managed the procedural elements with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing the documentation for weeks, which he had been. 2 remaining council members with documented connections to the falsification order had been suspended pending territorial review. The others, the ones who had voted with raised hands and said nothing for 2 decades, were still present, still seated on the dais, still technically in their positions. She was working on that. The compact, now legally invoked, gave her standing to request a full council review. She had drafted the request the previous evening in the secured wing, working by candlelight with the same methodical precision she had applied to the archive records. She had cross-referenced every decision made under Dorne's tenure that intersected with bloodline records. She had flagged 11 cases for immediate review. Her parents' execution was the first on the list. She did not approach that particular document with anything she would call emotion. She approached it the way she approached all records, systematically, looking for the specific language that revealed the mechanism, understanding the how so the how could be formally contested. Emotion was for later, for private, for the dark of the night, when there was no work to do and no reason to be precise. There would be time for it, she had decided this. If you watched her put her parents' names at the top of that list, stay on this channel, because she is not done yet, and justice in this world moves through paperwork and procedure, and she has become very good at both. Drop a comment. What does she deserve to have returned to her? Mara found her in the corridor outside the archive at mid-morning. Not the side entrance, the main entrance, the one Lillian had used with borrowed clearance for 14 months, the one she now approached with a formal access document bearing the Alpha King's seal and her own name in the veil line notation. She had not yet decided how she felt about walking through the main entrance. She was doing it anyway, because the alternative was continuing to behave as though she required permission for spaces she was entitled to occupy. Mara looked at the access document, then at Lillian's face, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You look the same." "I am largely the same," Lillian said. "You're not, though." Mara's sharp eyes moved across her with the assessment of someone who had spent years reading rooms and people from the functional invisibility of kitchen work. "You're standing differently." Lillian considered this. "The floor feels steadier," she said. Mara absorbed this and nodded, as though it explained something she had been calculating for years. Then she pressed a small cloth-wrapped parcel into Lillian's hand, the particular warm weight of food prepared with the specific intention of making sure someone ate, and walked away before sentiment could make the moment awkward. Lillian stood in the corridor with the parcel and understood that this was what restoration actually looked like. Not the assembly hall, not the compact seal. This, a woman who had brought her food in secret for years, doing it openly, in daylight, without looking over her shoulder. She ate standing in the corridor, which was undignified and entirely correct. Broderick found her in the archive an hour later. She was at the main table, not the corner shelf with the false panel, not the cramped lower access she had used for 14 months, but the main table with documents spread in her 3-column system under the full light of the high windows. He entered without announcement, which she had come to understand was simply how he moved through spaces, not inconsiderately, but with the baseline assumption that his presence required no performance of arrival. She did not look up immediately. She finished the notation she was writing. Then she looked up. He placed a document on the clear edge of the table. She recognized the format, territorial appointment, formal header, the Alpha King's office seal at the top. Provisional archivist, he said, with full access and the authority to flag records for territorial review, pending the council restructure, which will take approximately 3 months. She looked at the document. Provisional, she said. Until the review establishes permanent appointments, yours will not be contested. A pause. I am not in the habit of offering positions I do not intend to confirm. She looked at him. He looked back with the particular steadiness of someone who had already considered every objection she might raise and was prepared to wait for her to raise them. If you're watching her decide whether to trust the ground beneath her feet, follow this channel right now, because she has spent her entire life building something solid out of nothing, and what she does with something real in her hands is the whole story. Subscribe and drop a comment. What do you think she says? She picked up the appointment document. She read it fully, every clause. He waited without impatience, which was its own kind of answer to a question she had not asked aloud. The 11 cases I flagged, she said. I'll need unrestricted access to cross-territorial records for the review. You'll have it. She set the document beside her column system, inside the working space, not to the side. Then I'll start with the oldest cases first, she said. The pattern is clearest there. He nodded once. She returned to her notation. He remained at the table's edge for a moment, not leaving, not intruding, and then moved to the chair across from her and sat down. She did not remark on this. Neither did he. The same stone floor felt steadier beneath her feet. She noticed this the way she noticed most things now, not with surprise, but with the quiet acknowledgement of someone cataloging a change that had happened gradually enough to miss and was only visible in retrospect. The assembly hall's floor had not changed. The stones were the same. The mortar between them held the same cracks it had always held, and the cold came up through the soles the same way in winter. She had changed. 6 months since the compact's invocation, 3 months since the council restructure had been completed, and her provisional appointment had been confirmed without contest, as he had said it would be. 47 cases reviewed, 19 formally overturned, 11 still in process, including the oldest and most complex, which she was not rushing, because rushing records work produced the kind of errors that took decades to correct, and she had seen enough of those for one lifetime. Her parents' case had been the second overturned, not the first. She had placed a different family's case at the front of the queue deliberately because she had needed to know she could do the work without the personal weight making her imprecise. She had been precise, then she had done her parents. She had taken one evening for the grief afterward. A full evening, alone, in the archive after everyone had left, sitting with the overturned record and letting the weight of it be what it was without managing it into something smaller. Then she had returned to the queue. If you've watched her carry this the whole way, stay with this channel, because she's still standing and she did it herself, And what this hall looks like now compared to where we started is the whole point of everything. Drop a comment. What moment hit you hardest across all 10 chapters? The hall today held a different population. The wolves who lined the walls had not been there 6 months ago. Younger faces, lower-ranked members of the restructured territories, 3 representatives from outlying packs that had not previously held seats in any formal assembly. They were present because the new council structure required broader representation, which was a sentence that had seemed straightforward in the compact's language and had taken 11 weeks of procedural negotiation to implement in practice. She had been in the room for most of those 11 weeks. Not at the dais, that was not her position, and she had not wanted it. She sat at the long table to the left, with the records and the formal documentation, and when someone cited precedent incorrectly, she said so, and when a proposed amendment contradicted existing territorial law, she noted the specific clause, and when a council member spoke over a representative from the outlying packs, she set down her pen in a way that had developed, over time, into a signal the room had learned to read. People listened to her now. Not because of the Vale name, though the name was there, documented, uncontested, part of the formal record she had rebuilt. They listened because she was consistently accurate and consistently prepared, and because she never spoke to fill silence, which meant when she spoke it was worth hearing. She had not changed her voice to achieve this, she had simply stopped performing smallness. Mara had said 3 weeks ago over breakfast in the main hall, sitting openly at the same table, in the way that had taken Mara approximately 2 weeks to stop looking faintly surprised about, that Lillian had always sounded like that, just quieter. Lillian had thought about this for several days. She thought Mara was probably right. Broderick entered the hall from the side corridor, not the main doors, not with the kinetic declaration of 6 months ago, but the ordinary entrance of someone who worked in the building and was arriving for a scheduled assembly. He had done this every week for 3 months. She had stopped tracking his entry point after the 4th week, which had taken conscious effort and which she considered a reasonable adaptation. He settled at the head table and opened his own documentation without looking up. Then he looked up. Their eyes met across the hall with the specific quality of 2 people who had developed, without formally negotiating it, a shorthand for how the other was doing. She gave him the slight nod that meant the outlying representatives have a procedural concern I'll need to brief you on before we begin. He gave her the fractional adjustment of attention that meant noted, tell me after. 6 months ago, she would not have been able to read that. 6 months ago, she would not have believed she would be in a position to try. If this ending feels like something you needed, follow this channel right now, because we built this story 1 chapter at a time and you stayed for all of it, and there are more stories coming that will start exactly this way. 1 woman, 1 room, 1 moment before everything changes. Subscribe and drop a comment. Which character do you want to follow next? The assembly began. She opened her documentation to the first flagged item and waited for the appropriate moment. And when it arrived, she spoke clearly and without preamble, and the room oriented toward her with the uncomplicated attention of people who had learned she would not waste their time. No one looked away. Not with discomfort, not with the managed indifference of people pretending not to see someone they had decided did not matter. They looked at her the way people look at someone they are listening to, present, tracking, following the thread. She finished her point and returned to her notes. Across the hall, she was aware of Broderick's attention settling briefly on her before returning to his own work. Not surveillance, not the 4-month study of a political asset, something quieter than that and more ordinary and entirely without the architecture of necessity that had built it. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the floor. Steady, changed, present. She returned to her work.
She didn't wait to be believed. She rebuilt the proof herself, alone, for 14 months, without even knowing what she was building toward. If that kind of quiet, dangerous patience is your thing, I've got a woman on this channel who walked into an even uglier situation with even less, and what she built from nothing will keep you up tonight.